Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us over your lunch hour today for another one of our West webinars. My name is Lola Adebogan, and I am West's Marketing and Admin Assistant. Our topic today is Introduction to Exporting, presented by Jeff Starkey, who is the Senior Director of Market Intelligence at STEP. If you have any questions for Jeff as we go through the presentation, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box, not the regular chat box. However, do feel free to use the regular chat box to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your business. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. You receive an email tomorrow at this time with a link to the recording. With that, I'll pass it over to Jeff to now begin the presentation.
All right, hi Lola, and thank you to Wesk for inviting me to do this presentation today. I'm very excited to present to new and potential exporters out there. Just let me share my screen here. So today's presentation will really focus on introducing people to exporting. My name is Jeff Thackeray. I'm the Senior Director of Market Intelligence at Saskatchewan Trade and Export Partnership. I've been helping Saskatchewan companies export their products for over 15 years now, and everything's a challenge with that, but there's also great opportunity. So today's presentation will cover a bunch of areas. We're going to talk a little bit about what STEP is, who we are, talk about what is the export process, what are the steps, what do you need to do to identify markets to potentially export to, what you might want to consider before you export, and a little bit on the technical side of exporting, some of the topics that you really need to know and understand. Getting paid, we're going to talk a little bit about that because that is vitally important, and kind of what sort of assistance is out there for exporters. So STEP, or Saskatchewan Trade and Export Partnership, is a unique organization within Canada. We're the official trade promotion organization for the government of Saskatchewan, but we operate at arm's length. So we're a nonprofit corporation. We have a board of directors who oversees our operations, the majority of which are private sector individuals. We represent about 400 members across the province. About 250 to 300 of those members at any one time are exporters. The other are service providers. We have about 20 plus staff with offices in Regina and Saskatoon. So who are STEP members? They're all types of companies. They have to be Saskatchewan based. They have to have a service or a product that's ready to be exported or exportable. It can be anyone people who are kind of getting ready to be exporters and those who are ready to make that sale. And we deal with everyone from people who operate out of their house to the largest companies here in the province. So in terms of membership at STEP, I'm just going to touch on this briefly because sometimes this comes up. We do have three categories. We have pre-market, regular, and then premium. And these are our exporter categories. The one I will highlight right now is just the pre-market. If you're a new to exporter and you really want some in-depth service from STEP, this is a great option right now. That membership is 50% off. So it's only $200 annually for a company to become a pre-market member. So Saskatchewan and exporting. Saskatchewan is an exporting province. In 2019, we exported just under $30 billion in exports. If you compare that to other similar populated provinces such as Manitoba and Nova Scotia, we're per capita, we are a major exporter. This year, our exports are going to go up a few percent based off positive commodity prices in the ag sector. If you add, so that last slide, 30 billion was just goods. If you add in services and interprovincially, because when we talk about exports at STEP, we talk about everything from selling goods to Alberta to selling goods to China. So if you add those things in with the services, our exports go up to about $50 billion, and that represents about 2/3 of the GDP in Saskatchewan. So what do we export in Saskatchewan? So crude oil has typically been our #1 export, but this year potash will surpass that. Combined agri-food products are major, from canola and wheat to pulse crops. And a lot of what we deal with STEP is food and agricultural crops, but also manufactured goods, and even this other category here, which is all those other products people might export from the province, which is numerous. So where does Saskatchewan exporters export? The answer to that question is really everywhere. In 2019, Saskatchewan exported to over 150 countries. This slide represents where those exports went to and are shaded based on the amount of exports. Clearly, the US is our #1 export destination. But when you remove our #1 and 2, which is US and China, this is what the distribution looks like. So major markets outside of US and China include places like Mexico, Brazil, India, Japan, European Union, Algeria, Australia. So we really do export all over the place. The one thing I would point out is that while we exported to over 150 countries in 2019, over 27 of those countries we had over $100 million in exports to. So Saskatchewan really is known around the globe. So that's the sort of macro picture of exporting in the province. But why do companies export? There's a lot of reasons too. These reasons, research has thrown that a lot of these reasons benefit companies. But in reality, if you're a Saskatchewan company and you want to grow past a certain size, there is a limit in the province here with a population of 1 million. You do really need to look outside for customers. So that's the main benefit is you can grow to that scale. But there are challenges in exporting. So, different cultures when you go to, there's financial implications for your business, there's logistics, and there's even protectionism. So these are things we need to consider when we move ahead when making that decision to export. So I kind of came up with this slide, and it really is what I deem to be the basic process when exporting. When we're talking today, we're really going to be talking about what is called formal entry exporting. So that's a commercial export, typically over the value of $2,500. And the customs regulations and everything around that is a lot different than just sending a product to, say, someone in the US through the Postal Service that's valued at $50, which is a much simpler process, which would be called informal entry or mail entry. So in a basic export process, at some point the exporter would have received a foreign order. They prepare those goods, which might include many different things, such as packing to labeling to other regulations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we prepare the documentation, which we'll also talk about. And then they'll ship those goods to the market. When those goods get to the border, they need to get through customs. So that's called customs clearance, which is the process of moving that goods through the customs process and getting it approved for shipment into the market. And then the shipment continues and eventually arrives at your customer's door. So the common questions exporters might have or new exporters might have around this process is, who prepares the documentation? How will I get paid? What do I need to do to get my product ready to meet those market requirements? Who is responsible for that product during the shipments? Who owns the product during the shipment? Which isn't the same as who's responsible for it. Those are two different things, which we'll talk about in a little bit. What is the tariff rate that the customer has to pay, and who pays it, and who can help me with this? The one thing that we should touch on before we get into the other stuff is that in many cases when you're exporting, the importer is required to do a lot of the customs work and customs clearance, and they're responsible for actually importing that product to the market. Now, depending on many factors, how you want to do business, how you structure a deal, that responsibility can either lie with the exporter or the importer. And we'll talk about that in a little bit and what that implication means. But this is, regardless of if you're doing the importing for that customer or not, or you're really as part of that process, you need to understand the process they're going to. The last thing you want to do is make a product available for sale on, say, a website, have a customer order it, and then understand that they can't even get the product into the market. So most exporters get into exporting because they receive an order from a non-solicited order. So they get an order through their website or whatever else, and they got to fill that order. But if you want to be proactive and you want to think about, and you have limited resources and you don't want to sort of just answer orders, because for a lot of products, especially food products, other type of products like that, you really do need to adhere to a lot of regulations. So just filling an order for someone who ordered something in another market isn't always feasible. For example, like if you had a consumer product and you throw it on Amazon and then open Amazon up to buyers from different countries, Amazon doesn't manage that import process. They leave it up to the seller to ensure that their product is ready for the market. So you're not going to get those answers from Amazon. You need to do your research ahead of time and make sure that your product is meeting those market regulations. So you may or may not want to sell to every market. You may want to, if you only have limited resources, you may want to pick one or two if you're starting your export journey. So you can look at many different factors, from competition to, you know, do you have someone who speaks that language in your staff, to, you know, the amount of risk you want to take on, all those things. But like I said before, most people get into exporting because they get that export order and then they move to fill it. So a few things that as an exporter or a potential exporter you need to look into before you actually export is you do need to have an import-export business number from the CRA. If you do have an existing business number from the CRA, you just need to add on the export program to that business number through the CRA. The one thing you should note is that one of the documentation pieces that you're going to need to do as the exporter is do an export declaration for those commercial shipments. This is now done electronically, and all the information is right there on this slide. But the one thing I should point out is that it does take about 10 days to get registered with this program. So, you know, when you're responding to an order, that might not be so feasible. So if you are looking at being an exporter, you want to do this before you start making those transactions. I've included a link there from the CBSA, or Canada Border Service Agency's website, on a checklist that people can go through. And then you want to consider the regulatory side. You know, especially if you have a food product. If you have a food product, or if you make any health claims around your product, you really need to pay attention to this, because there can be very severe consequences for doing that wrong, or just shipping a product without paying attention to that. So you really want to look at what is the labeling requirements for your product. For most products, that might not be too much, but for food, that would be significant, and a market by market basis. You want to look at your packaging. Is that packaging allowed there? Is it not? Some countries don't allow, you know, wood straw packaging. Other countries, their pallets need to be certain sizes and have certain stamps on them to meet quarantine levels. If you have a manufactured good, you want to make sure it meets the safety requirements required within that market. For any products, if there's any certifications or permits you need. And at the very least, you want to make sure that you can actually export that product into the market. So some markets may have prohibited prohibitions, or may restrict a number of products from coming into a market. And you really need to check that out before you send your product, if you think it might be one that is banned, for example. So when we start talking about the technical side of exporting, we could go many directions. And for not knowing exactly what products everyone may or may not have, which I'm happy to answer by email, so what they might need to think about, we're going to talk about 4 different areas here. We're going to talk about HS codes and tariffs, those taxes on imports. Exports, we're going to talk about documentation, you know, specific documentation, and what are the main ones you need to know about as the exporter. We're going to talk about Incoterms, which are international commercial terms, which are very helpful in setting up your deal with your customer, and really defining the responsibilities of that deal from your standpoint and their standpoints. And then we're going to talk about logistics providers who are there to really help exporters, and for new exporters are very key for doing business in any market, including not just new ones, but veteran exporters leverage these guys to make their life simple and really deal with a lot of the things we're talking about today. So your HS code system is your harmonized system, and this is the central coding system for identifying products and exporting. So it really is probably the first thing you need to do before you export, is determine what your HS code is, because that'll really guide what happens down the road. It's used by almost every country. There's very few countries that don't use it, and those that don't use it typically don't even have classifications around products. They're typically very small countries, and they just apply a blanket tax rate to any imports, regardless of what they are. But, you know, in all the years I've been dealing with companies, I've never actually dealt with a company who has exported into a country that didn't use this system. So it really forms the basis of the customs tariff, which is the taxes around those imports. Basically, you know, the system is every product is assigned a numerical code. And that numerical code transcends boundaries at certain levels across all markets. So, you know, the good thing is that, or the most important part about that is that the border guards use it to determine what is needed for your product in terms of documentation, regulatory requirements, and what is the tariff rate applied to it. So you really want to get that correct. And we'll talk a bit about what would happen if you didn't. So this is an example of an HS code structure. So the 6-digit level, which is what you'll typically see, would be, for example, 040640. So that's the code that would be the same for your product once you determine what your code is across every country. So you would start as that as your basis. But when you get beyond that, when you actually start assigning a tariff rate or a tax rate to a product, you get to the country specific level, and that would be different for every single country you might enter to. So for example, if you have exported your product under a certain 10-digit code to the US for years and years, and then you just put that code on a product going to Mexico or Europe, it might not be the same, and you might get it wrong at that point. So just as an example here of what that code is, you know, if we were looking at a live cattle heading to Japan from Canada under 300 kilograms, not for breeding purposes, for slaughter, this is how it would go. You look at the section, you'd find out it's a live animal, then you go to the next level of that chapter and you look at live animals and it's a bovine animal. Then you look at all the codes underneath there, and then you'd pick the best one. In this case, you know, they only have about 5,000 or 6,000 codes. So not every single product in the world has an exact code. Basically, if your product doesn't fit well into one category, you just pick the other category and then apply from there. And these categories differ by country at that country level, which we talked about, and they differ by form. So it could be what it is, or it could be by function. For example, like if you were selling wheat, for example, which isn't a great one, but for small exporters. But if you're selling wheat, for example, to Japan, there would be a code for wheat that is to be milled. There'd be a code for wheat that is destined for feed, and there'd be a code for wheat that's destined for seed, and all might have a different tax rate applied to them. So why is it important to get this correct? And it's really hard to like know 100% if it's correct as the exporter, because you don't make that decision. The only one who really makes that decision is the border guard reviewing your documentation when it hits the border. I use this example. There's lots of things that can happen if you get it wrong. But the one thing people need to realize is that if you talk about the US, for example, the United States there, they have millions of shipments coming across their border every day, whether packages, containers, ships, whatever they are. The border services down there only has, or customs border protection down there, CBP, only has so much man resources down there. So they can only check about 2 to 3% of these shipments every day. So almost all shipments and exporting rely on the documentation that's presented and gets cleared that way. So they don't actually open the product up to make sure it's categorized right. They don't make sure the labeling's correct. So in theory, and what actually happens in many cases is that exporters can export for a long time and do it incorrectly, and it never shows up, and their shipments keep getting across the border and across the border. And then all of a sudden, after 8 years of exporting, the border guard decides to check their box for compliance, and they realize that they've been using the wrong HS code, that the tariff rate was different. So say you've been going under a tariff rate that's 2% and this one was 10%. Now they can go back and look at every shipment you ever made and apply that tariff back. And so you put, in some cases, there has been cases where people get a bill for hundreds of thousands of dollars because they use the wrong HS code. So you really need to think about that and doing it correct. You can always check with STEP. We can use our judgment for going through it. You can talk to some of your assistance providers, like we're going to talk about in a little bit here, customs brokers and freight forwarders. They can help you determine that. You have another option of going to the border services in the country you're exporting to and getting an advanced determination. This advanced determination is binding. That's the one thing with it. If you go to them and say, could you please evaluate my product and tell me what my HS code is? If you don't like that ruling, then you're stuck with that HS code, and it could have potential ramifications around tariffs for sure. Because most products fit nicely into one of these categories, but not every product does. Some products are pretty arguable about what they are. So you really need to think about that before you do it. But in some cases, if you really want to do it correctly, that's the route to go. If you want to get technical, the rules for choosing an HS code is a 7 or 8 digit step process called the general rules for the interpretation of the advanced or harmonization system. And it's just 7 steps. And basically it's, you know, if I'm to paraphrase it, it's really pick the best category that sounds like it fits with your product. It really is that simple. This slide has a bit more links about that advanced determination for the US. This is what most new exporters will deal with because the US is our major export market. But you know, the one thing I'd note is that each customs organization around the world within that country most likely have some sort of advanced determination system or process in place. So when you start looking at tariffs, if you do look at what it is and they throw you some documentation, you might get a lot of information thrown at you that you might not know about. The one thing you're going to be looking at is, and we'll talk about it a bit here, is, but you're really looking for that applied tariff. So that's the one that they're actually going to charge you. There is a bound tariff that within the WTO, all the countries who are part of that have agreed to submit these applied and bound tariffs to the WTO. And the bound really state is what's the maximum they could go in that tariff at any one time. But what you're looking for in most cases is this most favored nation applied tariff, this MFN applied tariff. And that's the one that all WTO members get for each other. If there is a free trade agreement in place, then you'll want to look at that one. So I'll show you what that kind of means here in a second and tools you can use to really, you know, find this. And the one thing you also want to realize is that there's different types of tariffs. So there's one's based on the percentage of the good. It might be 4.5% of the value of the good, which is typically based on the customs value of the good, which is cost, insurance, and freight. There might be a specific one. So it might be $10 per item or per number or per kilogram, or it might be a combination of both. It just depends on the actual code and the actual country. For most companies here, this won't be a big deal unless you're in the commodity space, the agricultural commodity space. But they do have things, many countries have quotas on products. So that really means there's a set limit on a product that can enter a market at a good tariff rate, which might be like 2% or free. But they really do protect their industry by setting these. So an example of this might be, you know, Japan allows maybe 100,000 metric tons of wheat and at 2% per year. And your importer would need a license to meet that quota. But it doesn't mean you can't export to that market. It just means that if you're outside of that quota, that rate could be 100 or 200%, which would basically close the market to that product. So really, unless you're dealing with certain agricultural commodities, maybe sugar, dairy, stuff like that, and Canada does this too, then that's not something you need to worry about for the most part. But if it is something you think might be there, you need to check on that. So the way you can determine what that tariff rate is in a country is through a number of different ways. If there is each country's customs organization publishes the tariff schedule for that country on their website, most likely. This is probably the most pointed way of finding things, but it is also hard to find those and they're not always in English. The WTO offers very detailed information, which I'll show you in a second, and what that sort of means on if you want to analyze the tariffs, if you're doing some market identification, maybe you want to use this tool. It's free. You have to register, but it's free. Or you can, talk with your importer. They might know what the tariff rate is, but you can't always rely on them. Sometimes the importers want to get stuff as, cheaply as possible, but as the exporter, you want to always be on the up and up. So I mentioned that world or WTO tariff analysis tool. This is what you might look at if you ran a search through that tool. So just for example, this is a little bit old, so I'm kind of, I kind of missed the boat a little bit with this one because there is a new trade agreement on CPTPP with Japan, but essentially this is what you'd be looking at. And you see that this, we're going back to that cow example, but this has a specific duty. So for each cow under the MFN current bound rate, which is that duty type 1 line there, it would be 38,250 yen per cow. Typically most countries, if you're exporting from a country that has a lower developed country, there'll be a preferential rate for that. And I should note that through all of this, when I'm talking about these codes, and I'm spending a bit of time on this because it's very important, is that that's where the country of origin is of your product. Typically, if you manufacture it in Canada, you make it here, the country of origin is Canada. And that flows into this. But I will note that, especially if you're going to the US, if you manufacture a product that's made with components not from Canada, there's a good chance that your country of origin might not be Canada, which might not qualify your product for treatment under the new CUSMA agreement or the new NAFTA, for example. So there is a process within that new Canada, US, Mexico agreement that talks about what you need to do to figure out your country of origin. If you manufacture a product that is made with components around the world, I do really recommend that people check out that chapter, read the agreement and figure it out. Try to Google it. There are some people who've done some workbooks on how to figure that out. But you really want to make sure your product is actually of Canadian origin. The one where I would recommend going to figure this out is that Canada Tariff Finder. And that's a government website, very easy to use. It really only deals with countries that we have a free trade agreement with though. So that's one thing you want to note. If you don't find that country there, like you'll put in, I'm exporting from Canada, I'm going to, and they'll have a list of countries. If your country that you're exporting to is not in there, then we don't have a established free trade agreement with them. So let's turn gears a little bit here and talk about documentation, which is where, a lot of exporters get hung up with a little bit. Your 3 main documents that you're required to submit as the exporter are your commercial invoice, which is just your sales invoice, your bill of lading or your packing slip, which basically says what's in the box and how's it get in there, and then your certificate of origin. And we talked about that, and that certifies that your product's from Canada. But like I said, if you manufacture a product that's based on components from different places, then you might need to go through that process and you might not be able to qualify as a Canadian origin good. Other ones that come up is that export declaration that's done electronically now. And then if you do have a food product or an agricultural product, could be phytosanitary certificates, health certificates. There could be certificates of conformity for other things. So you really do want to look at your product, check out the regulations in that market, work with your importer to figure that out. If it's commercial shipment, if it's a customer, they're probably not going to, like if it's a consumer and they're just buying something that you put on Amazon or on your website, they're probably not going to have any idea what to do. So especially in commercial agreements, you need to, when you make that agreement or you make that sale and you're negotiating that sale, you really need to define the responsibilities of the buyer and the seller. And one way of doing that is through the usage of international commercial terms or Incoterms. And these are terms that were developed by the International Chamber of Commerce. The beauty of them is that they're 3-digit or three-letter symbols that have a definition that spans languages and borders. So that term means the same thing in Algeria that it does here, that it does in China. And everyone understands who's required to do what under that term once they read it. this is the most updated version of Incoterms. I'm not going to go through them all here today. The one I'm going to point out, and that the Incoterms really define when that point of ownership changes from the importer, from the exporter to the importer's hands, and when that responsibility for the shipment changes hands as well. And each one of these is slightly different and kind of goes on a scale from one that really is easy for the exporter and one that's really easy for the importer. And when you're making these agreements in trade, you really do need to figure out, it really is a balance when determining this of how badly do you want to make the sale, how much work do you want to do, and what you're willing to do, and charging for that accordingly. So at the very simple end, you do something called EXW, which is X works. And basically, as the exporter, all you need to do is make that product available at your door. And then the importer is required for everything from shipment to the border customs clearance to shipment to their place. Now, a lot of customers don't want to deal with that and won't accept that term. So, if you have a very unique product that commands, that there's no other competition for, maybe you can do an exports sale, or you really don't want to export it, but that person's like, I really want your product, then you could sell it to them ex works. And the extreme other end is DDP, delivered duty paid. And that's where you as the exporter are responsible for everything, including being the importer of record, which would come with some, requirements at the border and on the taxation end on the other side, but you get it to your customer's door. Now, in many cases, especially if you're doing mail shipments, small shipments, it get through informal entry, and basically the post acts as your customs person and everything. They do informal entry, it's easy. But if you're doing large commercial shipments, you need to look at these and figure out where you want to be and what you're willing to do to get that sale. The one thing I would point out that you might have used these in the past, and it's pretty common in the past, but people might put like FOB Calgary, for example, which means that requirements move when the shipment gets to Calgary, but that's incorrect. It's technically a sea-based term, which when usually that ownership passes when it passes the rail of the ship. But people use it anyways. It's incorrect to use it. I'll just point that out. And then we have logistics providers, so freight forwarders and customs brokers. If you're new to exporting and you really don't know what you're doing and you want you want someone to take on this burden, these are your people that you want to talk to. And we have a number of these companies on our STEPS website in the directory. And there's a number based here in Saskatchewan. And so freight forwarders is a firm that specializes in movements of goods from one country to another. Could be the freight company directly, could be someone who's just a broker of freight services, bringing freight people together. There is a fee to this service, but they really take all that requirements. They do a lot of times they'll do some of the documentation, they'll organize the shipments. And a lot of them actually have a customs broker, which is a firm that specializes in clearing goods across customs. So this is a person or a firm specialized in the move and doing that customs process and doing all the documentation. Because if you have a formal entry, you need someone communicating with customs along the way as the importer, getting and submitting these things at the right time, paying duty at the right time, and responding to them. And that's where a customs broker can come in handy. I will note, and we're kind of coming up to the end here just a little bit, and we kind of glossed over a lot of things, but there is a lot to talk about in exporting. This is some sort of an intro. If you're doing a trade show in the US, even if it's small goods or whatever, you can't fill a suitcase with goods, bring it to the trade show and sell it. That's illegal, and you can't do it that way. So you can't sell goods in a foreign market at a trade show. You can take orders and then deliver that good from Canada when you get back, but you can't take goods and sell them there. You'd have to find somewhere to actually import them into that market, pay that duty, and then sell them there. But when people bring goods such as samples, demo, other things to the market, they use what's called temporary importation methods. And what the most common one is the ATA carnet, which is just a document you get that says that I'm going to bring this good into Canada or into this market, and then I'm going to bring it out of the market, and I'm not actually going to sell it there. Let's touch on very briefly, we could do a whole seminar on this, but let's just talk about getting paid, because that's pretty important as an exporter. It really depends on the transaction. If you're talking like a small consumer good that you're selling via Amazon, you get paid via Amazon, so that's really nice. If you're doing it from your own website, or you got an order over the phone and it's only like, you know, a few $100s and it won't bury you if you don't get paid, then you don't really need to do any formal things to protect yourselves. But if you're doing an order that's $50,000 and your company annually does sales of 100,000, if that buyer doesn't pay you, that could be pretty impactful to your business. So you want to leverage some tools that you can use to ensure that you do get paid. Before you leverage any tools, your due diligence is your most important thing. You need to understand who the buyer is and have faith that they'll pay you to the best of your abilities. And then choose your tools correctly based on how much due diligence you're able to perform. So there's several methods of getting paid in exporting. In a perfect world, you get advance payment, the buyer gives you money, and then you send them the product. That's not always the case in many markets, especially the US. If you're selling commercially in the US, a lot of people don't want to pay you right away. They'll do terms. So open account, they'll give you 30, 60, 90 days. Someone might want 90 days or even 120-day terms. And so that way you're hoping you get paid, and you probably will, but you know, there's no way of guaranteeing you will. So that's where something like a letter of credit comes into place. A letter of credit is basically, you get it from most banks who deal in commercial commerce will be able to offer this product. But a letter of credit is basically, you work with your bank, the importer works with their bank, and the banks agree to guarantee this payment. So that bank's backstopping, the importer's bank is really guaranteeing payment to your bank, and there's a fee for that. But it basically, as soon as you export your product in the way that you said you were, and you met their order, you'll get paid from their bank, whether or not the customer pays. So that's probably the most secure way. And there's many different letters of credits, and I would talk to your banks about this in detail, that what they're offering and what you might want to do. Export Development Canada, should point them out. They're a organization here in Canada, Federal Crown Corporation. They offer export insurance, credit insurance. So basically, if you're doing a commercial shipment and for a small fee, they will ensure that you get paid on that credit. So basically, they'll do their due diligence. They might open a letter of credit with a foreign bank, and then they'll guarantee you get paid regardless of whether that buyer pays or not. So they'll insure your shipment. If you do open account items, and you're dealing in a foreign currency, say the US, and there's currency fluctuations that might be impactful, that's a risk calculation that you need to make as the exporter. I just point out that there are foreign exchange firms. You can check out STEP's website and talk to those companies, but they do have tools such as forward contracts and other things where you can sort of buy currency ahead of time for a certain amount of money and sort of mitigate some of those circumstances. I'm not going to get into that, but just know that there are tools out there from providers who can help you with those currency fluctuations if you think they're going to be impactful to your business. So now talking about assistance for exporters, of course, there's STEP. We're here to help you. We'll help pathfind for you. A lot of the stuff we talked about here will help you navigate that. My unit does research for STEP. We do a ton of trade missions every year. Of course, COVID's impacted us, but we've done a lot of virtual stuff. We just did the SAS Trade Showcase, which is our big virtual event for the year. We did it last week. I would Google SAS Trade Showcase, go and check it out. You can still register. The event's not live, but you can go in and check out the booths, check it out. There's a bunch of webinars on there about Saskatchewan, about some of the unique innovations we have here. Check out some of those exporters. It's a neat thing to go check out. We have funding programs, STEP Market Access Program, which helps fund people marketing into different markets. There's Can Export program, which is a funding program from the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service. If you're dealing with a food or agricultural product, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture has a number of great programs available to you. And then EDC, that Export Development Canada, with their financing. So that's it for today's presentation. I definitely thank you. I tried to cover off some of the sort of main points in exporting, and you know, there's a lot going on. Everyone's product's different. The market regulations are different, but you know, it might sound complicated, but it's really just moving stuff across the border and making sure you do your homework and make sure you do it right the first time so you don't run into problems with any shipments. So definitely thank you for your time today. I don't have any questions so far, but if anyone wants to put one in there, I'd be happy to answer them, or you can always send me an email or that inquire line. And definitely thank you for your time today. So that first question from Amanda, do these same procedures apply for a small home-based business, for example? If it's very small, you'd get through that informal process. So like if you're sending it through the mail and it's below $800 into the US to a consumer, then there's really not that much paperwork required, and you can typically just send it through the mail and they'll take care of it. And I don't even know if there's cut duties at that point, although if that product of origin, for example, that textile is from China, then it might be a product from China and you might have some duties to deal with. So you really need to understand where that product is from and what the origin might be. So if you're just like, if you're doing fabric that you buy from China, for example, or India or Vietnam or wherever, and then you're reselling it, then you do need to look at that. So the country of origin will be China. So you might have some tariff implications there. If you're using a courier, oftentimes they'll just do the customs brokerage yourself. But if you're ever doing that commercial stuff, that's where you really need to pay more attention to this stuff. If you're selling to like a distributor down there or something like that. Yeah, so if you're doing so the next question has to deal with essential oils that are imported and then white labeled. The labeling doesn't matter and how your packaging won't matter. If that essential oil is from France or India, for example, which is a lot of essential oils come from India in the bulk level, then your tariff rate would be, you'd be searching by product, your country of origin would be India, and then your tariff rate would be what Indian companies face for that. So if you're selling that labeled product, labeled in Canada, bottled in Canada, but the oil is from India, most likely it's country origin India, and they might not have a free trade agreement with US, so you need to check into that.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful presentation and for volunteering your time. I'll wait for a little bit to see if any other questions pop up. Sometimes they do. But thank you to all of you who took time out of your busy days to join us. And don't forget to check our events page, west.ca/events, to register for our upcoming webinars. Next week, our webinar is titled Rebranding, How to know when it's time and what to expect. It will be presented by the Bark Design Girls, and you don't want to miss it. Registration is now open. And if there are no other questions, I will end the webinar. Thank you so much again, Jeff. And have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.